this meeting. It's been great. I've really enjoyed the talks, and it's really great to be a part of this group and this meeting. And so the working group that I'm talking about today initially started off as a functional traits working group. And at the GUBIC meeting in 2019, it kind of morphed into this idea that we have here that I'm going to present at least the beginnings of, which is looking at a network analysis of urban non-native species assemblages across global cities. And so this is the ideas of a lot of people here. The lead group was myself, Mila, Ingolf, Daijong, and Marta. And so these are the folks that were kind of initially interested in the idea, and folks that we've met together a couple times and through email right after the meeting in Toronto. I apologize to this group as I've not been very communicative since fall 2019, but we have been working on it, and so I'm taking this time to update you all to get your feedback, as well as the additional participants that we can see here who all signed up at our meeting in Toronto expressing interest. And I can speak for the group. We're certainly interested in having others join. You'll see that we're going to rely heavily on people's knowledge of their cities and different regions. And so this is really an inclusive group, and we're really interested in getting other people into this project. So the overarching question is, do cities throughout the world share similar invaders, and what drives differences? And to drill down into two specific questions, they're what determines taxonomic, phylogenetic, and functional similarity of invasive species among cities, and what are the main drivers of this similarity and their relative importance? And the way we conceptualize this is as a network. And so each of the nodes, these circles, are cities, and then the edges connecting the nodes are beta taxonomic diversity, beta functional diversity, or phylogenetic beta diversity. In that, if an edge aligned between two nodes is thicker, that means the two cities are more similar in either their taxonomic composition, functional composition, or phylogenetic composition of invasive species. And if it's thin, it means that they're not very similar, they're more dissimilar in their taxonomic, functional, or phylogenetic composition. And so this is a really nice way to kind of visualize the different cities and their relationships to each other in terms of similarity within this network context. We can also build networks for what we could call our predictor variables, what's trying to predict or drive that similarity. And maybe we have a network that shows trade or shipping or traveling. So you can imagine such a network where, again, each node, each circle is a city, and maybe the edges that connect the different nodes are transit linked between cities, maybe flights, maybe train, maybe roads, whatever it might be. And so again, we're conceptualizing how similar or dissimilar species are to each other, or how far they are from each other, or how many routes they are between each other with a network. Another predictor matrix might be just distance between cities. So again, we have the same network where the nodes are cities, and the edges here might just be geographic distance, climatic distance, elevational distance, and so forth, to better understand which cities are closer in these different distance attributes. And finally, we could also use the city characteristics and similarity in city characteristics to make a similar network where the nodes are cities, and then the edges represent, differences in green space, city size, city population, and so forth. And so ultimately, we can ask questions: are cities that have similar invaders, have similar percent green space, have a lot of flights that go between them, or have similar environment or similar elevation, or just geographic distance? And so all of these networks, obviously these are just schematic, can also be visualized or can be conceptualized in a city by city distance matrix. So we could use something like matrix regression to figure out, hey, what's the most important variable or set of variables driving similarity for invasive birds? Is it, again, environment, or is it the characteristics of the city? Or is it simply, if your city's closer to another city, you have similar invaders? And so we could do that, but by considering these as networks, we can also do some network analysis where we ask about compartments or modules of cities that are similar to each other, or hub cities that have high centrality in terms of dispersing non-native species to other cities. So it's kind of a nice way to kind of do two types of analyses: more traditional distance-based analyses and then network analyses. And so what do we need? We need a whole lot of data to do this. The first set of data we need are species. We need species lists for cities. And some ideas that the group has put forward is using iNaturalist, GUBIC data that people have contributed for different cities, IUCN invasive species lists, regional species lists, or local city lists. Once we have our species, we're interested in calculating functional diversity for these cities. We need traits. So the Elton data set has traits for birds. The TRI data set has traits for plants. And ants, which is another group we're interested in, we're still working and thinking about an ant trait database. To look at phylogenetic similarity of non-native assemblages across cities, we obviously need phylogenies. So we are proposing to use the Yates phylogeny for birds, the Zane phylogeny for plants, and again for ants, we still have some work to do on ants. And so we have the species, their traits, their phylogenies. Now we need the predictors of this phylogenetic, functional, or taxonomic composition. And so drivers we can get from all different types of sources and transportation and shipping networks from literature, climate and geographic data from things like BioClim, and then city data from literature or from GUBIC shapefile analysis. And so we're really going to look for everyone to think and discuss kind of innovative ways to extract information on the cities as we go forward. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is the progress we've made in getting these species lists for these cities. And so what I'm going to show you today is work that I've done with Daijang Li. He really did the heavy lifting on the data science here. And so he's an assistant professor at LSU. He gave a talk yesterday on his phenology work in cities and urban areas. And Daijang and I really discussed a lot of these ideas, and he really did the heavy lifting in terms of the data integration. So I just want to acknowledge that before going forward. Okay, so the first step is which cities? There's a lot of cities in the world. How are we going to select our cities? Obviously, we want to have cities that are distributed relatively evenly across the globe. And so what I'm saying here are kind of decisions and assumptions that we made. I'm really going to want your feedback to say, that's a great idea, or we don't really like that idea, or maybe we can tweak it, because these are kind of pretty important early decisions that we've made, and now I'm presenting to you to get your feedback from it. So from all cities that have a population size greater than 5,000 K in 2020, we kept the top 100 cities for each country, or the max number of such cities if it's under 100. Then within each country, we removed smaller cities that are located within 200 kilometers of another city. A city was also removed if it was not the only city left within the country it belonged to, and it is located 200 kilometers from another city in a neighboring country. And so this resulted in 458 cities, and this is what they look like distributed across the globe. And so we have pretty good coverage. Our initial idea, which we are certainly welcoming feedback on, was we wanted kind of a homogeneous distribution of cities across the globe, not have 60 cities clustered in the Northeast of the United States or something like that. We wanted this kind of spread, which was our thinking. And so the next step is that we needed to define these urban areas. We have these cities, and this has been something that was kind of brought to my attention in the first GUBIC meeting, that it's really hard to define and really contentious to define urban areas. So Daijang has found these shapefiles that rely on metropolitan area instead of administrative boundaries. And this metropolitan area is based on population densities. And so this example here is Atlanta, which is in the state of Georgia in the United States. And we could see this blue boundary here is the administrative boundary. So if you said, give me the city of Atlanta, that's what you would get. But using the metropolitan area provided by this resource here, we can see that we get a much larger area that's showing these kind of tendrils of Atlanta kind of leaping out. showing the areas of urbanization and high population densities. And so this red area here is what we're using to define the urban area for each of the cities that we've identified. So the next thing we need is that we need species lists for these cities. And so what we did first was we looked at occurrence records from GBIF for vascular plants, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and ants for 39 cities. And these 39 cities overlap with Mila Aronson's paper in Proc B that looked at urban biodiversity and invasive species for these 39 cities. Most of the records that we were able to recover from GBIF are birds and then plants. There's not really enough data for the other groups in general. So we're probably going to have to focus on birds and vascular plants. And we're also looking at ants because Benoit, I know I'm going to say his last name wrong, so I'll just call him Benoit for now, has a database of invasive plants in urban cities, in cities and urban areas across the globe. The only thing we'll have to think about a little bit critically is that the cities that we'll have ants for will likely be different from the cities that we have the other taxa for. And so we'll have to, figure out whether we include them together, how we subset them, or it's just not a huge issue, but something that we'll have to think about that going forward if ants have a different cities. So what about species from other sources? So GBIF had a pretty comprehensive data for birds, and it had a huge contribution from eBird, and so we're not seeking other sources for birds. GBIF has birds covered. For plants, we also tried to get occurrence data from BN, and again, about 89% of its data was from GBIF, so there was a lot of overlap there. So for birds, we're just using GBIF. For plants, we use GBIF plus BN. And for ants, we only have GBIF data at the moment, and we're hoping to query Benoit's database for ants as well. So once we have our species lists, we need to determine what's exotic, and what's native. And so for birds, we use the Gavia database, which is the Global Avian Invasion Atlas. And so we were able to figure out which of our species that we pulled from GBIF are considered exotic in a given area. For plants, we use GLONAF. And the same thing, we were able to figure out which observations we pulled from GBIF were considered exotic according to GLONAF. And we don't have that information for ants yet. Okay, our next thing we had to think about was our GBIF data and our BN data have actual locations, but Gavia and GLONAF have kind of just range maps of exotic species. And so we had to kind of figure out how we were going to, take our urban area and figure out what species were actually in there. And we came up with two ways. The first is just to use the exotic species from Gavia and GLONAF and assume that the species will be in the urban area if the distribution overlaps with the urban area. So we just take those stacked distributions and say, oh, look at that. It overlaps this, the metropolitan boundary of Atlanta. We're going to count that species as being there. The second way we thought about it was using the intersection of these two lists. So you have to actually be observed there on GBIF, and you have to be have your range map overlap from Gavia or GLONAF to kind of confirm, yes, this species is here. We found a record for it, and it's supposed to be there. It wasn't a misidentification. Gavia or GLONAF has it being there. And this approach will obviously be more conservative. And so let's look at just some of our results here. Approach 1 is our less conservative, and approach 2 is our more conservative. And so let's just highlight Berlin here, city that folks may know a lot about. We can see we have 5 bird species and 299 plants identified using the less conservative approach. And the more conservative approach recover those 5 invasive birds, but a few less plant species. If we look at Istanbul, we can see that we have 2 invasive exotic bird species and 169 exotic plants, but we can see we have many more exotic plants over here when we look at it's blocking me. Much fewer, excuse me, my window is blocked. Many fewer plants when we look at our more conservative approach. And then if we look at Hong Kong, we can see using a less conservative approach, we have 28 exotic birds and 461 exotic plants. And the more conservative approach has considerably fewer birds and plants there. So when we plot this out a lot, this first plot over here, pardon me, this should say birds, number of exotic birds from Gavia. And so this is how, when we do our just pulling from the overlap from our first less conservative approach compared to the number of exotic birds from Aronson et al. And so we can see here at species poor cities, we kind of end up on both sides of the 1-to-1 line, and same here at more species rich cities. When we look at plants here, we can see most of our points are above the 1-to-1 line. Here with the data from Aronson et al. That could be for a couple reasons. It's obviously, 6 years later, depending on when they pulled the data for Aronson et al., likely beforehand. And so we can see that how we're kind of comparing to the data, the biodiversity of exotic species found in that paper and what we found using our method. When we use our more conservative approach, we don't have many changes here. When it comes to birds, and when it comes to plants, we can see we hug the 1-to-1 line a little tighter, but we still, when we get into these species-rich cities, we're still finding many more higher diversity in our way of extracting exotic species lists than this original approach right here from 2014. So what are the next steps? So this pipeline ready thanks to Daijang's awesome data science. And we can extend to all 458 urban areas that we've identified that we showed you on that map. Our guess is that many of them, half of them maybe, might not have enough data from GBIF and BN. And so that could be a problem. We say, oh, we have a bunch of these cities that we do not have, really good inventory or even any information from GBIF or BN. And another thing to think about is we can complete these species lists with other information. And so by using the GUBIC data sets, local experts, literature search, et cetera. And so something that we might be able to do here is once we all figure out what cities we want to use, whatever methodology, we go with our methodology, we discuss how to add on, then we can use either one of the methods we showed here. Then we can pass that list on to folks that are either from those cities, or compare them to lists that are already in GUBIC, or identify local experts from those cities that we might have in our network to say, hey, here's our list of non-native birds from city Y. We know that you know a lot about it. What do you think about this? And kind of fine tune those lists, with some more information to get as accurate lists as we can for exotics. We can add new cities with data already compiled by GUBIC, or if someone has a lot of information on cities that we haven't picked out, that is certainly another option. And once we nail down our cities, then we can say, all right, now we need to start on these covariates. Now we need to look at, find if they're on shipping routes. Now we need to get information on city structure, city size, percent green, percent impervious surface, temperature, and all those variables. But first we just need to hone in on which cities we want this for before we go on that task to find all that information. And so that's all I have for you here. We really need your feedback. This is, again, Daijang and I just kind of thinking about the way that we can get the most data in ways that make sense to us. They may not make sense to you. And so, like I said, we want A, your feedback, B, you to be part of this project with your expertise on different cities, on exotic species in urban areas, and on all the components of it. So we really want that feedback.